Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Raw Men. This time, this is episode 64, and I'm responding to a news story that a lot of my fans, followers, readers, whatever, viewers, whatever, have been asking me to comment on. It was an article in the New York Times that was talking about reclassifying Dinosauria, and I'm not really in a position to say that, to go into what the story is about. I mean, there are people certainly much more adept in this than I. So I sought out probably the most adept figure I could. This is Dr. David Eberth, and I met him at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta, Canada, a few months ago, almost a year ago, I think. Gave me a tour of the facility, and it was a very impressive one. We got to see some very interesting fossils that the public did not see yet because they weren't out of their matrix, so to speak. Anyway, Dr. Eberth, how do you do, sir?
Very well. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm kicking. So on this article that I understand that this was somebody that's just trying to get their degree, and I guess this is something that he was writing for his thesis or whatever, and then it caught attention from instructors or professors or what have you, and then they say, "Wow, I think you're onto something." This is what I seem to get out of this, and it was a reclassification of the dinosaur family tree, which, by the way, in the Phylogeny Explorer project, we haven't yet classified dinosaurs. I've been avoiding that myself and allowing other people to hit other areas. I'm expecting that somebody would be excited to have the dinosaur classification they could play with. What is your opinion on this class project and the goal behind it?
Yeah. Your intro there is kind of accurate, actually, in the sense that the student, as students will do, was looking at a variety of historical hypotheses about what defines dinosaurs and how they're arranged phylogenetically. And like many people before him, he noticed that many of the morphological characters didn't really fit the traditional orthodoxy. And so armed with a whole new technology in terms of the massive computing power that we have at our fingertips now, as well as a whole raft of new discoveries of primitive dinosaur-like animals, the student basically just went to his supervisor, David Norman, a friend of mine, and basically said, let's have a look at this orthodoxy, the way that the dinosaurs are arranged, and see if it holds sway. I mean, this has been in place since the 1880s, so well over 100 years. Of course, Dave Norman and his colleague, Paul Barrett, are very famous for looking at orthodox interpretations and overturning many of them. So they encourage the student, knowing full well that the student himself may end up wasting his time, may confirm the existing orthodoxy. On the other side of the coin, it was an interesting gamble. And of course, the student, as we know from this paper, in a sense, struck gold. Really what the student has done is taken the major divisions of dinosaurs. If you consider the orthodoxy, which is that we have saurischian dinosaurs on the one hand, and we have ornithischian dinosaurs on the other hand. So we have the lizard-hipped dinosaurs and the bird-hipped dinosaurs. He's basically blown that apart. The Saurischia, according to this paper, no longer exists the way that we thought it did. The student ended up finding out through a massive analysis of 74 taxa and 400, 500 characters that the meat-eating dinosaurs, the theropoda, which had been part of Saurischia, are actually more closely related to the plant-eating dinosaurs, Ornithischia. This is a major revolution in the way we think about dinosaurs, and it has incredible implications, not just in terms of the rearrangement of the animals, but it has implications about how dinosaurs evolved, why they evolved, what characteristics, how these animals made their living ecologically, what they did. It has implications on things like the origin and evolution of feathers, why some groups seem to have feathers, why some groups don't. It's basically resetting the entire framework for looking at dinosaurs.
Okay, so you just clicked on something that clicked with me. Now, in Harry Seeley's, I mean, Harry Seeley was a 19th century scientist who
You
was
bet.
became something of an expert on dinosaurs, and he was the first one to come up with this categorization based on lizard hipped versus bird hipped. And I'm saying this, of course, not for your benefit, but for the people watching. And something's rubbing against your mic. Let's be careful about that. Is it yours?
You bet.
Okay. Yeah, anyway, so you had on one side, you had the sauropods, which is the giant dinosaurs, the brachiosaurs, the brontosaurs, the apatosaur, and so forth. All the long-necked dinosaurs as people would recognize them. And kind of paired or in a sister group with that was the theropods, which were the bird-like dinosaurs, the meat eaters, the velociraptors, T-Rex, and so forth. And then you would have your ankylosaurs and stegosaurs and
the ornithischians, right?
Yeah. And so that would be another group. And now the repairing is what they've done is where the theropods were kind of a sister group to
sauropodomorphs. Yeah, the
very good
diplodocus-like things.
And what would you call the ornithischian? I've been saying this wrong, I think, my whole life. Ornithischians. That's right.
Ornithischians. There's, this based on Greek and Latin, which are dead languages. You can pronounce it any way you damn well please.
Okay, well, very good. So now they've run the theropods and so forth as a kind of a sister group to essentially what is the stegosaurs and ankylosaurs and ceratopsians, which leads me to a question. Nobody, it seems, ever suspected that sauropods had feathers or feather-like down, so far as I know, right? I mean,
we haven't found any specimens either in the primitive forms, the clades that are closely related, or the most primitive versions of sauropodomorphs. So as far as we know right now, those animals didn't have feathers. The fly in the ointment that's outside the door, that's just, really trying to knock on the door, is that when you look at dinosauromorphs and dinosauriforms, you get animals like pterosaurs, which have filamentous structures that are not feathers, they're like a hair-like structure. So then this raises the possibility that there was some kind of structure that led to the development of feathers.
And for those who don't
that hasn't been
going,
found.
Yeah, for those who don't follow where you're going, the pterosaurs split off from what would become dinosaurs very early on.
That's correct.
And they come slightly ahead of dinosaurs. So if the thinking is that if the pterosaurs had this like
filamentous structure, yes,
is it something similar to down, or could become down, something like that? So a
that's
thing.
That's being debated as we speak.
Okay, so if pterosaurs had this kind of a semi-downy covering, and they came before dinosaurs, and this was a trait that should have been retained by perhaps some of the dinosaurs at least. I mean, and sometimes when you get very close to the emergence of a new trait like that, it can turn on or off, so that one lineage can get it and the other lineage can lose it.
There's no reason why those kinds of structures can't evolve separately. That's all part of the theory of what's going on here. So ironically, our phylogenetic structures, our phylogenetic hypotheses allow us to set out those questions, whether or not those structures evolve separately or together. Okay. Right now, though, just getting back to the question you originally raised, right now, it looks like there are no sauropodomorphs and there are no animals within that newly defined group of saurischians, now that we've taken theropods out and moved them over closer to ornithischians, both of which have feathers and filamentous structures. There are no known fossils that show within the existing Saurischia feather-like structures. And that's kind of cool.
Do we also have skin impressions, right? I think of a trachodon, perhaps. This would be the duckbill.
Yeah, we're literally swimming in fossilized skin and skin impressions within higher order ornithischians.
Okay, and they're predominantly not feathered that you're seeing, right?
That's correct. Once you get into the more recent forms in the late Jurassic and throughout the Cretaceous, in terms of Ornithischia, we see very little, if any, evidence for feathers. What we do see are in animals like psittacosaurs, which occur in the earlier Cretaceous. We get filamentous structures that look very much like some of the primitive feathers that we see also in theropods. This new hypothesis that Barron et al. Have put together really helps us understand that distribution of feathers that previously was a little bit confusing to us.
Okay, so when you mentioned psittacosaur, to give people idea what you're talking about here, imagine a like a parrot build, what would be a triceratops, but it doesn't have any horns, it doesn't have any frills. It's like the stripped down no options model, except that on its tail it has these spiky appendages, and there's something about the spiky appendages that it's not bone, it's not horn, it's
keratinous. It's keratinous, or it's some hair-like structure. Yeah, there's no.
So
I should say feather-like structure, not hair.
So what makes that interesting is that, and this was something that threw me when I was at the Houston Museum, and they have a skin impression there for a triceratops, and they were showing me these circular patterns about yay big, right? And they're about, I think about a foot or 18 inches apart from each other. And what do these look like to you? And I'm thinking, these look like feather quills. It's like when you pull the feathers out of a bird. And it's exactly, so we've never found the quills, but we found these impressions that look like they would accommodate quills. And so they were talking about how if they've got the phylogenetics right, and Triceratops is descended from psittacosaurs, as they were suggesting, then maybe these filaments these keratinous filaments that are on their tail had migrated further up the back, so that Triceratops would actually look a bit like a porcupine.
Yeah, I would tend to question that. I'm a little uncomfortable with that designation, but there's certainly no question when you get down to the more primitive forms and the earlier forms and those that are more distantly related, but still good ornithischians, that those forms have those structures. If you become if those structures are being used for insulation to keep the animal warm or to regulate its body temperature, there's no question that as the animal gets larger, there would be relatively little use for such structures. And in fact, that's the kind of hypothesis that we apply to most theropods. We envisage animals like Albertosaurs, the tyrannosaurids, if you will, possibly having juveniles that would have downy-like feathers. But as the animal gets larger, all evidence indicates that those animals have no feather-like structures on them whatsoever. So there's all sorts of ontogenetic pathways that one can imagine where the feathers are present in the hatchling but not present in the adult. And then when you start adding in the evolutionary component, literally over tens of millions of years, these structures can appear, can develop, or can disappear in the taxa. The important thing is to look at the primitive organisms that make up the clade and see what characters they share.
I want to clarify something again for those who are watching and maybe not, well versed in this. What we're talking about now is similar to why smaller animals are furry and fluffy, but things like elephants and rhinoceroses are not. So you have a great deal of heat retention in a much, much larger animal, so there's very little need. Whereas a Tyrannosaurus chick might be covered in downy, or like the Delong paradoxus in China.
Right.
I don't know if that was determined to be a small tyrannosaur or if that was a juvenile.
It's a small animal. It's a small individual, regardless. Yeah.
Okay, and so they determined that this is covered in down of some sort, but they don't think that the full size tyrannosaur had this down.
That's correct.
So what got me was we had, just to refresh people again, we had like on the one side, you have the ornithischians. Ornithischians is the way I've always said it.
There'll be a test later, man.
Yeah. So yeah, the ankylosaurus and stegosaurus, and there's some interesting transitions between them too that a lot of people don't realize. I mean, when I was going through a list, like an illustrated book of all these different types of ankylosaurs and stegosaurs, and there's a place where they're so similar to each other that you can't really tell them apart. And that's, is that a stegosaur? Is it an ankylosaur? Well, it's actually both, not neither. So I mean, this is the way transitional species work. But I mean, you have that collection, and then you have the giant sauropod collection, and they used to put the velociraptors and T-Rex over with the sauropods. Now they've moved them over to this other group. That's essentially what all they've done in this study, right?
That's correct. Think of it this way, that we use these terms, they have historical meaning and then they have scientific meaning. The terms ornithischia, the term ornithischia that you're talking about, the plant, everybody's favorite giant plant eaters, that group has not been changed. It still contains the same members that it always did, and it still has, in a sense, the same definition. The theropods, more or less, with some exceptions of the most early members and the most primitive members, that group still remains the same. That group Theropoda, though, has been removed from being closely related to the sauropods over and joined with, in a sense, the ornithischians. That new combination has been given a new name. That name is Ornithocelida. And that's, yeah, another name to contend with.
Yeah, or you're sure that Ornithocelida?
Again, you can, the beauty of the paper that generated all this that we're talking about is that the definition of that new group, Ornithocelida, has more than 20 characteristics, really good morphological characteristics through the entire skeleton, the skull, the vertebrae, the limbs, even the teeth, that allow that group now to be robustly defined. So that's the new taxon. Nothing's really changed for the theropods and the ornithischians except their relative place. The real bomb that got thrown in, that's got everybody kind of excited, and I won't even say upset, because frankly in our community, most scientists are looking at this and going, I kind of knew something was wrong. So
I'm going to be
people aren't upset. We're chewing on this bone pretty hard right now. Everybody's kind of excited about it. But the real bomb that got thrown in is that Saurischia, the term Saurischia, which is such a large, inclusive group, has been blown up. And so that is now redefined. So Saurischia took it in the neck. And that's what's really going to cause the problems in the textbooks, because it no longer today, according to this paper, and if this stands the test of time, that group, Saurischia, is going to be the one that causes the problems, because there's going to be 100 years of textbooks. There's going to be all the information that's all over the web that we all know to be true. That's been blown up. So theropods are still theropods. Ornithischians are still ornithischians. They've just been grouped differently. Saurischians are no longer Saurischians. They include, it's a little bit complicated and it goes into the weeds, and I won't waste your time with it, but they're basically a group that includes mainly the sauropods, the Diplodocus-like animals, plus this primitive group of what are called Herrerasaurids, which have always been a little bit problematic because they're relatively poorly known. And so that's where like the rubber hits the road.
Aren't the Herrerasaurids like the oldest dinosaurs?
They're among the group that are the oldest, yes.
Okay. So we've seen a lot of times, or I've seen very often, where the people who are adamantly against science will criticize scientists because saying, well, science is wrong sometimes. Pluto used to be a planet, and now it's not, and there used to be a brontosaurus, then there wasn't, then there was again.
Provisional truth versus absolute truth. Yeah, you're cutting right to the heart of the issue.
And I'd like to explain to people that when you play the game of 20 questions, every question that you ask will provide you with new information, and you will find out that your previous preconceptions or whatever may be incorrect, or maybe you'll confirm some of them, but you'll still be hashing it out. You don't ever have it right at the first go, and your information always changes, but the change is always an improvement. And that's the way science works. It changes, but it is always an improvement. So this is, and the other thing that I want to bring up is there's no defense of the dogma, the status quo, because the only way to get rich and famous as a scientist, and indeed this guy's showing this, is to upset the status quo, to challenge.
That's absolutely right. I gotta jump in, Matt, because it's a really good point that you made. When I give talks, I don't do as many as I used to, but when I give talks to creationist groups, which is always a treat, one of the things I try to impress on them is that, and they never buy it, of course, but I have fun making the point, is that if I could indeed provide evidence that shows that humans coexisted with organisms from the Carboniferous or the Jurassic, pick your favorite time frame, not only would I become one of the most famous paleontologists in the world, I'd become one of the most famous scientists in the world. And that just human nature being what it is, why wouldn't I want to do that? This whole notion, what you've hit on is the point that to follow that line of logic as a creationist would, or people that have a real problem with provisional truth, is simply to assume that human nature doesn't work the way it does, that there's some kind of conspiracy out there, and you have this global scientific community comprising hundreds of thousands of people around the world that somehow are getting a secret document every day that tells them, how to maintain the conspiracy in a unified voice. We don't do that. We're the poster child for herding cats.
Yeah, so you managed to maintain this conspiracy with no leaks, despite centuries.
Exactly. So yeah, the whole notion of provisional science is a good one, or provisional truth in science is a good one, and runs absolutely counter to the typical creationist point of view.
So when you mentioned that people are saying, okay, well, I kind of thought there was something wrong. Well, here's me, right? So, I look at the sauropods and I look at the theropods, and we've got sauropods and theropods kind of together. And then we have the ornithischians over on this other side. And so why is it that we have the cetáceosaurs and possible keratinous, because it didn't fossilize with the rest of the skin. So why didn't it?
Yeah, my specialty, in fact, isn't phylogenetics. We're talking about phylogenetics today, and I did quite a bit of this when I was starting off my career back in the 70s. My specialty is actually looking at depositional environments, stratigraphy, radiometric dating, and paleoenvironmental controls on preservation. And you don't have to, you really don't have to think long and hard on this. All you have to do is look at the modern world to see landscapes and environments around you, and even on a larger scale across a continental expanse, to understand that organisms stand different chances of being preserved depending on where they are, the kinds of environments they're in, and the kind of history they're going through. The same obtains in the fossil record. And in fact, typically, there are some great exceptions to this, but typically the smaller you are, the less muscle mass, tendons and ligaments you have holding you together, and the quicker and more easy it is for you to fall apart and rot, be destroyed by predators, be decomposed. And so your chances on a statistical basis alone of being preserved, the smaller you are, the worse that is. And it just so happens that the most primitive dinosaurs, the dinosaurs that we're really talking about in the Triassic, and this paper isn't really concerned with Cretaceous dinosaurs and Jurassic dinosaurs. Once those groups got established and they're on their way, it's a lockdown. What this paper is doing is focusing in on this really early group of dinosaurs. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know it, that primitive ornithischians, primitive Saurischians, now newly defined, primitive theropods. All of these animals are small. They're small, light bipeds. In fact, if you want to have fun, just go on Wiki and type in any of the generic names for any of these early groups in the Triassic. And the reconstructions and the pictures you'll see on Wikipedia or any dinosaur site, the bloody animals all look the same from an artist's point of view. They're small, lightly built bipedal animals, and because of that basic dinosaur form of primitive forms being small, their chances of preservation in any given environment is considerably less than the larger, more heavily armored, more massive forms that show up later. So it makes sense that this situation with this paper would happen, that as it's taken, since dinosaurs first were conceptualized and found, regardless of the names that were used, it's taken 150 years for us to gather enough material of these small primitive forms that first appear in the fossil record to be able to do a proper analysis. Finding the big boys, finding the hadrosaurs and the theropods and the T-rexes and the ankylosaurs, that was relatively easy. Those things preserve like Jack the Bear because of their massive size and the fact that it took a lot in the system in the time they died to tear them apart and destroy them. These little guys, it took very little effort to destroy them. So it's taken us as human beings and scientists 150, 200 years to gather enough material to do a proper analysis. It's really what's going on here.
Okay, so as I said, at one point I fully accept that the theropods have feathers, and now I hear people talking about ornithischians having feathers, and that
right.
threw me, because why didn't it throw me that if the sauropods and the theropods are so closely allied, that why isn't there a problem with the fact that the sauropods don't have feathers? And I'm tweaking at people suggesting that there's feathers in the other group when of course it makes sense that they would be closely aligned if that's the case. So you have essentially feathers or feather-like structures only coming up on one of those sides. That would make more sense if it's rather than having it turn off and disappear in the next line.
Well, it's all about what shows up in the primitive forms. In a sense, because we're driven by the evidence, once we have the phylogeny, the hypothesis built into the phylogeny, of what constitutes a primitive ornithischian, those are the animals we go to look at to see what the primitive condition is. What those animals do in an evolutionary sense literally over 100 million years after that is of less concern. What I'm talking about, why the feathers issue is important, is that when we go over now to the Saurischia, what the newly defined Saurischia, that is what we used to think of as Saurischia minus theropods, there are no primitive members there that have evidence of feathers. And that's the difference. Primitive ornithischians from the Triassic some of them have feathers, and into the Cretaceous. Certainly the theropods do, that's not an issue. But
so
all we're saying, yeah.
That would be one of the links to justify his reclassification.
Yeah, it actually isn't a character that's used, but it's the hypothesis that this team has generated helped explain that.
Okay.
That's the way that works. So it's all about the primitive forms.
Can you give me a real simple, fast layman's explanation for the different characters that you use to determine a phylogeny when we don't have genetics?
Yeah, this has been a source of debate, going right back to the the 1950s when phylogenetic systematics first appeared. The characters we typically use are anything we can get our hands on, to be honest about it. And the more characters you have, the more robust your phylogeny is going to be. So in some ways, it's not the character itself, it's the abundance of characters. But that said, there's no question that if I show up with a roadkill fossil that looks like, it's 1/3 of the animal And it's really hard to interpret because it's been destroyed by preservational processes. And I start, talking about I've got 100 morphological characters in the skeleton in this fossil that I can use. And then somebody else comes along, with a counter hypothesis based on evidence from beautifully preserved skeletons. Their hypothesis is going to be given more weight because of the quality of the material. So there are all these factors of preservation, abundance that go into abundance of characters that go into assessing the validity and the strength of a phylogenetic hypothesis. In fact, if you think of phylogenetic hypotheses as a simple hypothesis, they're the endpoint. They're the hypothesis that's generated and put out to the scientific community, to the public. But really what's going on, if you look at the paper, the original manuscripts and papers, you'll see that there are a variety of confidence intervals tests that are done on the strength of the hypothesis. And so even in this paper, this is kind of fun, even in this paper, the new definitions for Saurischia turns out to be very robust based on the statistical tests that are done along the lines that I just described: quality of preservation, number of characters, so on and so forth. But if you read the paper that came out in Nature, they have to redefine Dinosauria as well. And as a result of that, the definition for Dinosauria is less well supported. They had to throw out some of the specimens in their analysis when they were looking at Dinosauria and testing, the validity of what's left of Dinosauria and what's left of Saurischia. They had to throw out some very troubling specimens to get those numbers to be very robust. And this is where it's cool. I think these guys have absolutely nailed the relationship that Theropoda and Ornithischia now form this new clade, Ornithocellida. I think that's really robust. What this paper is going to do is there's going to be a ton of workers and students coming at the weak part, the Achilles heel of what they have to say. And that is our definitions of Dinosauria, Dinosauromorphs, Dinosauriformes, all of this bundle of primitive forms in the Triassic. That's going to grab everybody's attentions. And I promise you this, that over the next 5 to 10 years, if you're into this stuff, you're going to see lots of debate about what it is to be a dinosaur as a result of what's happened now. The outcome of this kind of work strengthens up part of the phylogeny, but weakens another part of the phylogeny. And that's where all the attention is going to be focused in the future.
So let me see if I understand you correctly. When you say you're throwing out certain forms, contested forms or questionable, uncomfortable forms or whatever, it's just
where the preservation is terrible.
Oh, as a preservation is terrible. Okay. Because I was going to say that there were other things that, based on the criteria, you might eliminate what you think was a basal dinosaur, and then realize that it's actually prior to dinosaurs. That
you got it. That's it right there. You got it right there. And so that's where this paper, in my opinion, is really important. Like any good piece of science, it directs your attention to the next step of the analysis.
So I want to throw out one other thing. Robert T. Bacher had proposed including pterosaurs in Dinosauria. And I'm thinking there's probably more problems in that than people calling it dinosaur birds or flying dinosaurs suddenly become birds because they're different, or they're different lineage in the same lineage as birds, so that would confuse a lot of people. But what about the Ornithodira, where it splits between Pterosauria and Dinosauria? You have other organisms that often nobody knows about that are at the base there. Is that correct?
Well, they don't know them as well. Yeah, you're basically recasting what we were just talking about. That once you get into the Ornithodira, the origins of Ornithodira, once you get into looking at the forms in the Triassic, these small, delicately built archosaurs, in the early and middle of the Triassic, your preservation and number of specimens drops way down. And it's going to focus our attention not only into reanalyzing these animals and coming up with new hypotheses. You referred to Bob Bakker's hypothesis about including pterosaurs. I mean, Bob also proposed, was one of the first people, if not the first person, to try to define what a dinosaur actually was. His work was refined subsequently in the 1980s and made more robust. But one of his original ideas actually, actually had a completely different kind of arrangement of these major groups that has been found to be falsified. What's going to happen in the future is, as you say, there's going to be a lot more work, not only reanalyzing this, but going into the field and looking for new specimens. This is really cool. I mean, one of the hypotheses in this paper is that dinosaur origins didn't occur in Gondwana. I mean, ever since I can remember, we've all thought dinosaurs originated in the southern hemisphere of the world, some southern hemispheres of the world. What Barron and his colleagues have done now is basically, by looking at this rearrangement, they're proposing that Dinosauria may have actually emerged in Laurasia, in the northern hemisphere. What that's going to do is very cool. That means that young paleontologists are going to be looking at the rocks around them, the Triassic rocks around them, and go, hey, maybe we haven't been working these rocks hard enough. Maybe we need to get out and have a closer look at what's going on here. Maybe we'll find more evidence of how dinosaurs originated in the northern hemisphere instead of the southern hemisphere. So again, this is a powerful paper. This is a powerful piece of science because in so many ways, it's directing people, showing people which way to go to investigate and go take the next step. Very cool.
Well, I hope you will. I hope you'll be open for further communications at some point, because I mean, there's an awful lot that I would love to pick.
Yeah, we didn't even get into omnivory on this thing. Carnivory and omnivory as the ancestral state for dinosaurs. Absolutely wonderful little piece of work. I just wanted to finish off, Aaron, saying that it's been amazing in our community to watch everybody's reaction to this. I think I alluded to it before. I haven't talked to anybody that's upset about this paper. That's, I'm going to write a retort. I'm going to respond. Everybody's chewing on it. And it's an artifact of the incredible computing power that we now have at our fingertips, that these types of literally hundreds of millions of alternative phylogenies can be generated in a computer and then be analyzed and spat out at the end 20 minutes later. We didn't have access to that kind of computing power when I started in the game. And the technology, the technological revolutions are at work in paleontology, just like they're at work everywhere else in our society. And this is one of the outcomes of that.
At the risk of being anticlimactic, I mean, I did a presentation once upon a time where I was talking about how hopeful I was that turtles would turn out to be the last surviving anapsids. And then I said, okay, now if this is true, then this is the sort of fossils we should find. And if I'm wrong, if it turns out that they're diapsids after all, then this is the sort of fossils we should find. And I'm sorry to say that my hope there was not fulfilled. It turned out that the subsequent evidence that was discovered after that indicates that turtles are a derivative of diapsids. And for people who are listening to this don't even know what an anapsid is, there aren't anymore. There was a whole lot of them before the age of the dinosaurs, a lot of things that were before the age of the dinosaurs, a whole world full of pre-dinosaurian weirdness, which is, you mentioned earlier in this talk, name your favorite period. And I think the Permian or the Carboniferous, or somewhere in thereabouts.
Permian's wild, man. Atmospheric oxygen concentrations were off the charts. Wonderful, bizarre period of time. Would have burned our lungs if we took a time machine back then.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to let you go. And was there anything else Dr. Eberth, that you wanted to say before we close?
Nothing in summary, but just for between you and me, I want to toss out. I'm sure you're no stranger to Thomas Kuhn's, structure of scientific revolutions idea, and in
I'm
some
not
ways,
actually familiar, believe it or not.
in it just really short, a brief synopsis. He basically said that a scientific orthodoxy will go, running along for so long, everything's fine until enough evidence is gathered by people in the community that there's this sudden tipping point. So rather than the change happening gradually, the orthodoxy maintains its dominance even when members of the scientific community know that it's wrong, until enough evidence is marshaled that the entire thing is thrown out very, very quickly. So it's this long stasis, rapid revolution, long stasis, rapid revolution idea of changing scientific paradigms.
That's what happened with tectonics, isn't it?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And this paper actually helps modify that in ways that we didn't understand back. That was a paper of Thomas Kuhn's work was back in the 60s. This paper actually introduces the notion that technological innovation and advancements are also part of that structure of scientific revolutions. And that was never considered by Thomas Kuhn, and nor should it have been, because technological innovations weren't happening as rapidly back then. A lot of what I'm driving at is a lot of the philosophy of our scientific philosophy of science ideas are also going to be upended as more and more of this kind of work, not only in paleo, but in all aspects of science, continues on. And that's kind of cool that this kind of work and the technological revolutions are also impacting our notions of philosophy of science. So I'll just leave you with that kind of unformed thought. It popped into my head this morning, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to throw it your way.
All right. Once again, Dr. Eberth, thank you very much for coming on and explaining this and doing so much better than I could have in this case.
All right, man. Good to see you again.
Good night.